Disney, a company that has endured more so than any other company of animation has done in the last 100 years and has been entertaining millions worldwide and held its ground as one of the greatest American institutions for generations. But no company endures for that long without having a couple of tricks up the old watercoloured sleeve. Even though Mickey Mouse doesn't actually have sleeves, for Christ's sake man, put on a shirt! Or in this case it comes to retracing previous success, and with the release of Zootopia, or Zootropolis, whatever you call it in your country, it has got me to thinking that a lot of the movies that Disney's been putting out the last couple of years do have more than passing similarities to the movies from the Disney Renaissance era, or the 80s and 90s to be more specific. Now, I'm not going straight up conspiracy theories to suggest that Disney has had a major plan laid out since the 1950s of repeating the same series of events every 30 years, but it would surprise me if Disney weren't taking a little inspiration from their past. And to illustrate that, I'm going to be going through an abridged history of the Disney Renaissance era to the 2000s, and the 2000s era to now at the same time. So let us begin. Well, first off, we have to consider that before both those times, Disney was going through a bit of an awkward spot. After major people leaving the company at rather awkward times, they were having trouble deciding on their creative processes and making rather odd decisions with their movies, which eventually culminated in some of the worst movies the company has ever made. And while the majority of these movies were by no means terrible or even bad, and there was the odd gem here or there, it didn't quite capture audiences' interest as much as the previous films did. Disney, of course, realised this and realised they needed to oomph up their movies a little bit, so they decided to take inspiration from their past and make movies like they were a couple of years back, where they were a lot more popular and a lot more successful. And they did that, but still keeping things familiar to the style that they had been doing through the last few years to keep it familiar to the modern audience. Sadly, while these movies were a bit more successful than the previous outings, they weren't massive blockbuster successes that Disney were hoping for. So going back to the drawing board, they decided it was time to have a complete fresh start, brand new crisp animation for the modern day, and retelling stories of classic fairy tales like they did back in the old days, but with new and modern styles to them. And of course, as we know, these movies were massive successes, making the company millions of dollars and adding a new face to the entire industry, and thus ushered in a new era of Disney prosperity, ushering in countless amounts of great films, great songs and great animation to go along with them, and lots of merchandise. And so we got a movie about a teenager in a fantasy world looking for more in her life, a heartbreaking story about love conquering all, a heavily comedic action-based adventure, and an animal-themed story about responsibility in an adult world. Strangely mimetic, isn't it? The only wrench in this theory does come down to Wreck-It Ralph, since its equivalent from the 80s would either be Great Mouse Detective or Rescuers Down Under, and neither of those movies can be really directly related to old Ham Hands. Some might also argue that its equivalent is Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and in many cases that is true, but for the purposes of this theory it's not, because it came out 1 year before Little Mermaid, and Wreck-It Ralph came out 2 years after Tangled, so that's an unfortunate thing right there, but the rest of it all adds up. Ralph's not wrecking this theory. I'd also like to mention that regression doesn't mean remakes or reboots like The Jungle Book and Pete's Dragon. I'm also leaving out sequels because Frozen 2 or Wreck-It Ralph 2 have no equivalent from the Disney Renaissance era, unless you count those direct-to-video sequels, which I do not, and nobody should. You may have also noticed that I left out Pixar as well, and that's because I consider Pixar a separate entity to the mainstream Disney animation format. Don't get me wrong, they are fantastic movies, but Pixar spawned from a company that eventually joined Disney, and while they have been more slowly integrated into the mainstream Disney format, such as Merida from Brave being considered part of the main Disney Princess line, and Pixar characters' inclusion in Disney Infinity, the mainstream Disney animation films are what represent the company as a whole. So, as you saw, almost all Disney movies from the last 15 years can be linked back to films made between 1988 and 1994, and even future movies can be loosely linked for the time, such as with Moana's premise of a young native explorer reminiscent of Pocahontas, and Gigantic's exotic European setting and classic literature roots, this being Jack and the Beanstalk, can be seen similar to Hunchback of Notre Dame. So, looking past things that might not actually be there and me just looking into them too deep again, what does this all mean? I haven't a clue. I just thought it'd be fun to bring it up. And I'm sure I'm not the first one, but what the hell. But in all honesty, my only hope for this, rather than a thought of where it might be going, is that even though I'd love to see old movies from the 90s brought back in a new way, I hope that the criticisms aren't kept the same again. Because while Pocahontas and Hunchback and the subsequent Hercules and Mulan were all good movies in their own right, and some had some hit or miss moments, the majority of them weren't well accepted by critics and alienated some of the regular fans from their more niche concepts and in some cases even animation. But only time will tell in that regard. But in all fairness, any company that's been around for a really long time is going to start repeating itself eventually, particularly Disney, that's been around for even longer than most companies in America. Hell, most companies in the world have ever been, so there's going to be a bit of repetition in there somewhere regardless. It is just a tad weird to think that a lot of these movies they're bringing out now are almost copies of the premises or stories or characters or even just some small elements of films they had out 15-20 years ago. It's by no means a bad thing, but it is kind of funny, but at the same time really awesome. Disney, for all its successes and its faults, feels like a company that will be around forever, but no matter how much longevity something has, it has to come to an end eventually. So for Disney, that's always in their mind that something will eventually come to an end, and because of that, they have to keep thinking of ways of keeping themselves going. So if that means copying a couple of things that worked the first time around, what the hell? It's no real bad thing that they're copying something that worked the first time. It would be nice to see a couple of new ideas come out of them regardless. And even in that regard, this isn't exactly something that's uncommon to all companies. If we look at Warner Brothers, that constantly reboots the Looney Tunes every couple of years, and for better or worse, they're still going to be around for probably another 50 or 100 years. That's not really doing something wrong or being lazy, that's just trying something that works and something that's beloved and doing it again. It's just not been given a new face, that's all. And in many cases, if you can give something a new face, but it's too similar to something that already existed, it can often turn heads and make someone think, why didn't you just do the same thing again? But in some cases you can get something good out of doing the same thing but just with a new face on it. But in some cases you do have to give something a new lick of paint to make it look nice and fresh for a new audience and regain the interest of an old one. And it clearly shows because Disney's been doing a lot better than it did in the early and mid 2000s. So while we may never know if Disney is doing this intentionally or unintentionally, there's nothing wrong with doing something again if it worked the first time, and the movies we have been getting the last couple of years have been fantastic, as you can see by my eagerness to have them on my shirt or on my wall. But it would be nice to see something completely original come out of the company. Although, when they do that, it doesn't always quite turn out that great. You know what, Disney? Stick to this schedule and doing original TV cartoons, because quite frankly, I don't want to see another Home on the Range or Chicken Little.